Welcome, focus learners, to this explainer. Today, we're going to dive into one of the absolute most magnificent structures ever built by human hands. And honestly, we aren't just talking about a static ancient wonder here. We're talking about an architectural phoenix that just flat out refused to die. The Temple of Artemis at Ephesus. It's a wild story. We've got staggering wealth, deep religious devotion, completely devastating destruction, and remarkable rebirth. So get ready, because the true story of this legendary site is way more dramatic than you might think.
Here's our roadmap for the journey today. 1. The ultimate ancient wonder. 2. Flood, fire, and fame. 3. The third and grandest temple. 4. Decoding the Ephesian goddess. And finally, 5. Fall, ruin, and rediscovery.
All right, let's jump straight into section 1, the ultimate ancient wonder, beyond the pyramids.
So, to really wrap our heads around this, I want you to ask yourself, what building was so breathtakingly magnificent that it literally made the Great Pyramids of Egypt look kind of dull by comparison? I know, it's hard to imagine, right? The pyramids are basically the gold standard of ancient majesty. But to the ancient travelers who had actually seen the whole world, there was a clear, undisputed champion of architecture.
Take the Greek poet Antipater of Sidon, for example. This is the guy who actually compiled the list of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. He had seen the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, the Colossus of Rhodes, the towering pyramids. But here is what he wrote. When I saw the house of Artemis that mounted to the clouds, those other marvels lost their brilliancy. And I said, Lo, apart from Olympus, the sun never looked on aught so grand. He considered the Temple of Artemis to be the absolute crown jewel of human achievement. No contest.
Moving right along to section 2. Flood, fire, and fame. The cycle begins.
Now, achieving that level of greatness, it wasn't a one-and-done deal. It was a chaotic cycle of destruction and rebuilding over centuries. The site's dramatic life kicks off in the 8th century BC with the first periperistral temple, which was likely the very first Greek temple surrounded by colonnades anywhere. But in the 7th century, a massive flood completely wiped it out, leaving behind just a thick layer of sand and some precious jewelry. Now, you'd think they would move, right? But despite the incredibly swampy, flood-prone ground, the Ephesians stubbornly refused to relocate their sacred spot. Instead, they built a much bigger temple around 550 BC. That one was famously burned down in 356 BC, only to be rebuilt once again into its final, most awe-inspiring form in 323 BC.
Let's look closer at that 550 BC version, often called the Archaic Temple, because there was a massive leap in ambition here. Sponsored by the incredibly wealthy King Croesus of Lydia and designed by a Cretan architect named Chersiphron, this thing was an absolute behemoth. We're talking 115 meters long by 46 meters wide. It's actually considered the very first Greek temple built entirely out of marble. And it wasn't just a religious site, it was an economic powerhouse too. Archaeologists digging in the foundation deposits found over 1,000 items, including the earliest known inscribed coins made of electrum, which is a natural silver-gold alloy. So it was quite literally built on a foundation of immense wealth.
But, all that marble and money couldn't save it from one guy with a torch. In 356 BC, a man named Herostratus deliberately set fire to the temple's wooden roof beams. And his motive? He just wanted his name to be remembered forever. He achieved what we now call Herostratic fame, basically the ancient equivalent of doing absolutely anything just to go viral. The Ephesians were so furious, they made it a crime punishable by death to even speak his name, which obviously failed. But actually, modern historians have this really fascinating counter-theory. Because the temple's foundations were actively sinking in that swampy marsh, some scholars think Herostratus might have just been a useful idiot for the temple priests. They desperately needed a reason to build a brand new, stable temple, but they were blocked by strict religious constraints. A convenient fire? Well, that solves the problem.
Which brings us to section 3, the third and grandest temple, the Phoenix Rises. Whether it was a rogue arsonist or a complete inside job, that 356 BC destruction set the stage for an epic rebirth. Now, historical tradition claims that on the exact night the temple burned, Alexander the Great was born. Fast forward a few years, a grown-up Alexander marches into Ephesus and graciously offers to pay for the entire reconstruction of the temple. But the Ephesians, they tactfully refused, telling the conqueror it would be improper for one god to build a temple to another. I mean, wow, that is the ultimate diplomatic burn, right? But it perfectly showcases their staggering wealth and their fierce, independent identity. They definitely didn't need the great conqueror's money, they were going to do it themselves.
And when they rebuilt it, they absolutely did not hold back. 127. Let that number sink in. That is the staggering number of columns that surrounded this new, massive structure. And these weren't just standard pillars.
This grandest incarnation expanded the whole footprint to 137 meters long by 69 meters wide. Those 127 columns, they stood a towering 60 feet tall, with many of the bass drums intricately carved with reliefs. The interior was basically a who's who gallery of classical art, featuring masterpieces by the absolute greatest sculptors of the age, like Polyclitus and Phidias. The columns were even gilded with real gold and silver. This incredible structure wasn't just a place of worship. It was the cultural, diplomatic, and economic heart of Ephesus. It functioned as an international bank and sanctuary, and it survived in this breathtaking state for an incredible 600 years.
On to Section 4. Decoding the Ephesian Goddess, Myth versus Reality.
Because, you see, a temple is really only a house. To truly understand this wonder, we have to look at the resident patron goddess herself, where myth and reality have been deeply tangled up for centuries. The crucial thing to know is that the Ephesian Artemis was remarkably different from the Artemis most of us know from standard Greek mythology. The classic Hellenic Artemis is the virgin huntress of the wilderness, right? She's running around with a bow and arrow alongside her twin brother Apollo. But the Ephesian Artemis? Totally different. She is heavily influenced by older Near Eastern and Egyptian deities. She is a protector of cities, wearing this elaborate mural crown shaped like city walls. Her body is enclosed in a rigid pillar-like form, which projects these deep, ancient roots that predated the Greeks even arriving in the region.
Now, for centuries, statues of the Ephesian Artemis have been identified by one very specific and highly controversial feature. You've probably seen the images, the so-called many-breasted goddess, which scholars in late antiquity interpreted as a symbol of hyperfertility. But modern scholarship has totally flipped this on its head. It turns out, this biological interpretation was largely fueled by early Christian writers like Jerome, who were aggressively mocking and attacking pagan beliefs.
The real story? Those oval shapes were never intended to be biological anatomy at all. Remember that 8th century flood we talked about earlier? Well, archaeologists in 1987 actually found drilled, gourd-shaped amber drops in the debris there. It turns out these oval objects on the statue were just ceremonial decorations, likely amber jewelry or maybe even ceremonial eggs that would have been physically hung on the ancient original wooden statue. Over centuries of artists copying that dressed-up wooden original into stone and bronze, those hanging adornments were mistakenly carved as physical features of her actual body. It's a completely fascinating example of how history can get totally rewritten just by simple misinterpretation.
And that brings us to Section 5, Fall, Ruin, and Rediscovery, the Final Erasure. Because all things, no matter how magnificent, eventually meet their twilight. Let's look at the slow demise of this ancient marvel. Unlike the sudden dramatic fire of Herostratus, the final fall of this temple was a slow, agonizing erasure. The fatal blows began in 268 AD, when raiding Goths under leaders like Respa laid waste to the city and severely damaged the temple. But it was the shifting religious landscape of the late Roman Empire that truly ended its life. By the 5th century, during the intense persecution of pagans, the temple was officially closed down for good. The cultural shift was so absolute that early Christians systematically chiseled the very name of Artemis out of inscriptions all across the city. Eventually, those grand marble blocks were completely scavenged, broken down, and repurposed to build other structures throughout the region. The grandest wonder of the ancient world just quietly vanished into the foundations of the Middle Ages.
It laid completely buried in marsh mud until 1869, when a British architect named John Turtle Wood finally relocated the site after 6 grueling years of searching. Later expeditions by David George Hogarth between 1904 and 1906 pulled up the incredible archaic foundations and sculptures that you can actually see in the British Museum today. But what is truly amazing to me is that the site is still giving up secrets right now. Just recently in 2026, archaeologists investigating a Roman latrine on the site found something deeply poignant. Carefully wrapped side-by-side Middle Byzantine graves of premature infants from the 8th or 9th century CE. It shows that long after the mighty goddess had fallen, this ground remained a place of deeply human, sacred significance for centuries.
So what's left? Well, today, if you visit the site near modern-day Selçuk in Turkey, you won't see 127 towering pillars. You will see exactly one. A single, solitary column, pieced together from mismatched fragments, just standing quietly in a marshy field, right where the ultimate wonder of the ancient world once touched the clouds.
And that leaves us with a pretty big final thought to ponder. When a wonder of the world is reduced to just a single column, does its true legacy actually live in the physical stone,
Or does it live in the stories we just keep telling about it? The Temple of Artemis burned down, it flooded, it was literally erased by rival faiths. And yet here we are, thousands of years later, still completely fascinated by its memory. That is the true Phoenix Arc. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and as always, keep learning.